Welcome to the deep dive. India. You hear it all the time, right? The next global superpower, this land just uh, teeming with youthful energy, historic promise.
Mm.
It really feels like it could be a global leader.
Absolutely. The potential is undeniable.
Yet, beneath those headlines, the booming growth ones, the research we've looked at for today's dive, well, it uncovers this fascinating paradox.
Yeah, it's like a nation poised for greatness, but seemingly held back.
Exactly. Held back by these really deep-rooted, almost invisible systemic challenges. So today we're going to try and pull back the curtain a bit on how these issues tangle together and what it, actually means for India's big ambitions.
And what's really striking, I think, is how these things aren't separate problems. They really intersect, they feed off each other, and that's what really slows down progress.
Okay.
So we'll be looking closely at four main systemic challenges that kept coming up in the material we review.
All right, what are they?
Well, first, rampant corruption. We're talking multiple levels here.
Mhm.
Then the issue of unqualified, sometimes uneducated politicians. Third, an education system that's often described as obsolete.
Stuck in the past, yeah.
Right. And finally, a public that seems largely unaware or maybe apathetic about these big systemic issues.
Okay, so let's unpack that first one then. Corruption. Our dive today reveals what's been called like a deep-rooted cancer.
That's a strong way to put it, but it fits.
The material really paints this picture of it being systemic, institutionalized almost. It seems to permeate everything: governance, infrastructure projects, education, health, even law enforcement,
Mhm.
from the small petty bribe in a local office right up to these massive national level scams.
And what our sources really highlight is how this isn't just, inefficiency, it's deeper. It's this subtle erosion of trust.
Right.
It breeds this kind of cynical acceptance, like, oh, well, that's just how things are.
Yeah, normalization.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that leads to, well, inefficiency in governance. Sure, projects get delayed, or the quality is just substandard because funds have been siphoned off.
Okay.
But also, citizens become cynical. They start accepting corruption as normal, like you said. And it weakens the institutions themselves. The courts, the police, local governments, they just can't function independently.
Makes sense.
And think about this. It actively discourages innovation, investment. Honest businesses get put off by all the red tape, the bribery culture.
And the numbers associated with this are just, well, they're pretty striking. The Commonwealth Games scam back in 2010, the figure mentioned is a staggering 70,000 crore misappropriated.
70,000 crore. It's hard to even picture.
And then the coal scam in 2012 involving misallocated coal blocks, that led to an estimated loss of 1.86 lakh crore to the public purse.
Just imagine for a moment the impact numbers like that have. Think what could otherwise be invested in, public services infrastructure that benefits you directly.
Yeah.
It really, really underscores the enormous cost of this problem being so deeply entrenched.
So you might be wondering, okay, if there's this widespread corruption, how do leaders get elected? And this brings us right to another critical roadblock the research points to, which is the, well, surprising lack of basic qualifications for the very people shaping India's laws and policies.
Yeah, this one's quite something.
The electoral system, as the sources point out, it doesn't actually mandate minimum educational qualifications for politicians.
Nope, no requirement.
Which means you get many elected representatives who might have, frankly, little or no real understanding of complex areas like economics, science, law, administration.
And the consequences are, well, profound. You often end up with poor legislation, laws passed without real depth of knowledge or foresight about the long-term impact.
Right.
And this often leads to sort of the promotion of populism over actual sound policy.
Ah, so it's more about the quick wins.
Exactly. Freebies, emotional appeals, manipulating sentiments, that often takes precedence over careful long-term planning. It's not really about genuine, impactful governance in those cases.
And here's a statistic from the documents that really makes you stop and think. As per ADR data, this is from 2024, over 43% of sitting members of parliament face criminal charges.
Over 40%. It's a shocking figure.
It really is. And it begs the question, doesn't it? Why does this persist? I mean, what do our sources suggest allows this kind of situation to just continue year after year?
Well, what's really insightful here, I think, is how these deep-seated societal structures play a role. Things like the persistence of dynastic politics, where families hold power for generations.
By the name recognition factor.
Exactly. And also caste and religion-based voting patterns. These things don't just allow unqualified leaders sometimes. They can actually actively entrench them
How so?
because loyalty to a family name or to your community group can tragically end up being more important to voters than actual competence or, a clean record. So it creates this self-reinforcing cycle that's incredibly difficult to break out of. Plus, a general lack of political awareness among parts of the public doesn't help either.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, let's pivot a bit to education. This is the third major point.
Yes, the education system.
The material highlights symptoms like, well, a heavy focus on just memorization, rote learning, rather than creativity or problem solving.
Learning by heart.
Yeah. Outdated syllabi, a neglect of vocational skills, practical training, digital literacy, and these really rigid exam systems. It sounds, frankly, like a system kind of stuck in the past.
It does, and the impact is really significant. There was a 2023 report by NASSCOM showing that over 60% of Indian graduates actually lack job-ready skills.
60%, that's huge.
It is, and it leads directly to unemployability or underemployment. It also fuels the brain drain we hear about.
Right, talented people leaving.
Exactly. Talented individuals migrating abroad, looking for better opportunities because the system at home isn't serving them. And it results in low innovation overall. India files far fewer patents compared to countries like China or the U.S.
And structurally, what's behind this? The reports point to things like, well, government apathy sometimes, definitely underfunding, less than 3% of GDP going to education, which is quite low.
Very low by international standards.
And also a notable lack of sort of autonomy and accountability within educational institutions themselves. Now, if the education system isn't really equipping citizens effectively, it's maybe not surprising that this leads into the fourth critical challenge our sources highlight.
Which is?
Widespread public unawareness and apathy. This comes up again and again as a major bottleneck for progress.
Yes, this is a crucial piece of the puzzle.
The documents observe that a huge majority of the Indian population is either uninformed, sometimes misinformed, or just simply indifferent about how governance works, what their rights are, what policies are being made.
And the reasons suggested for this apathy are varied. Poor civic education in schools is one factor.
So people just don't learn how things work.
Right. Then there's media distraction, often focusing more on sensationalism, celebrity gossip or political drama, rather than substantive issues.
Okay.
Linguistic, regional, cultural divides also play a part, making national consensus difficult. And look, for many, many people, just the daily struggle for survival simply takes precedence over political activism or engagement.
Understandable. Yeah. You're focused on putting food on the table.
Absolutely. So demanding accountability isn't always top of mind.
So what does this actually mean for the country's progress, then? Our sources describe this apathy almost like a self-perpetuating cycle. But how do you actually break a cycle like that when the very people who need to demand change are, in many ways, kind of caught within its grip?
That really is the core challenge, isn't it? This apathy, unfortunately, translates directly into a lack of demand for accountability from leaders.
Makes sense. If you're not paying attention, you don't push back.
Exactly. It leads to the re-election of corrupt or incompetent leaders because people aren't informed or engaged enough to vote them out. And it results in low participation in informed public discussion, in pushing for necessary reforms.
So it becomes like a silent partner in this stagnation.
Precisely. It allows the other problems, the corruption, the poor governance, to continue more easily. And beyond these core four issues, the research also mentions other notable hindrances, things that add more layers to the challenge.
Like what?
Well, there's bureaucratic red tape, excessive paperwork, endless permissions, delays. It just stifles innovation and investment.
The infamous Indian bureaucracy.
Indeed. Then there's a massive judicial backlog. Over 4 crore, that's 40 million cases pending across Indian courts. Justice delayed is justice denied, as they say.
40 million.
There's also inequitable growth. Prosperity is often concentrated in cities among the elite, while large parts of rural India, Dalits, tribal groups, minorities are left behind.
Right. The benefits aren't shared evenly.
Not at all. And finally, severe pollution and environmental degradation. This is driven by unchecked industrial growth, sometimes poor urban planning. Indian cities are consistently among the most polluted globally, and that affects health, productivity, everything.
So it's a complex web. Given all these interconnected problems, what does this mean for the way forward? Do the sources offer any pathways to solutions?
They do. And the key emphasis is that you can't just tackle one thing. Addressing these interconnected issues needs a really multi-pronged approach. You have to hit it from several angles at once.
Okay, so what does that look like?
Well, first, political reforms.
Yeah.
Things like mandatory disclosures for politicians, assets, criminal records, maybe even educational qualifications. Electoral reforms to try and curb candidates with criminal backgrounds from even running.
Right.
And strengthening local governance, making it more powerful, and transparency tools like the Right to Information Act, the RTI, making sure that's robustly implemented.
Okay, politics first. What else?
Second, a major education overhaul. Focusing on a new age curriculum, one that actually emphasizes skills, critical thinking, logic, creativity, not just rote learning.
Makes sense.
Improving teacher training is key too. Upgrading infrastructure. And, crucially, increasing investment in public education and research, getting that percentage of GDP up.
Got it. Education, next.
Third, fighting corruption head-on. Using digital governance, e-governance to minimize the human interface where bribes often happen.
Reducing opportunities.
Exactly. Stronger implementation of anti-corruption laws like the Lokpal Act, that's the independent ombudsman idea, and whistleblower protection, and really empowering the independent watchdogs like the Comptroller and Auditor General, the CAG, which audits government spending, and the Central Vigilance Commission, the CVC, which looks at vigilance in central government bodies.
Right, strengthening the checks and balances.
Precisely. And finally, boosting civic awareness and participation. This involves things like media literacy campaigns, helping people discern real news from fake, better civic education in schools right from a young age, and supporting NGOs and civil society groups that work at the grassroots level to engage citizens and make them aware of their rights and responsibilities.
So political reform, education overhaul, fighting corruption, and boosting civic awareness. It sounds like a huge undertaking.
It is. There are no quick fixes here.
As we wrap up this deep dive then, it seems pretty clear that India's road to really fulfilling its immense potential isn't blocked by a lack of talent or resources or ambition even.
No, the potential is there.
But rather by these deep systemic barriers, the corrupt practices, the unqualified leadership in some areas, the outdated education system, and this widespread public apathy. And they're all tangled up, aren't they? Feeding off each other, perpetuating a kind of stagnation.
Absolutely. And if you connect this to the bigger picture, unlocking India's full potential, well, it truly requires a kind of collective awakening.
An awakening.
Yeah. Ultimately, what our sources emphasize is that true prosperity, real progress, it isn't going to come just from government decrees or, catchy slogans or subsidies. Instead, it needs this profound collective shift. An awakening where citizens demanding better isn't just about politics. It's about challenging that very apathy, that normalization of mediocrity or corruption that has become, as you said, a silent partner in stagnation.
So it's a call for action from the ground up.
Exactly. It's a call for informed action that has to start at the grassroots. A kind of bottom-up revolution, really, in civic engagement. Citizens must demand better, vote responsibly, educate themselves and others, and hold those in power truly accountable. So this deep dive has explored these intertwined challenges and some potential solutions for India's path forward. As you, the listener, consider the role of civic engagement we just discussed, here's something to think about. What specific non-governmental initiatives or perhaps community-level efforts do you think could be most effective in bridging that gap in public awareness and actually fostering accountability right there at the grassroots level?
Definitely something to chew on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.